So we're going to try and blast through surrealism, get ourselves over to America by the end of the day today, which is where we'll spend the last. We have 4 classes left, right, counting this one. 2 this week and 2 next week. We'll try to finish up as much as we can in 3 of those so we can spend the 4th one doing some review. We'll see what happens, right? So we were talking about surrealism, which is this movement that begins in 1924, right, but has a lot of legs prior to that. There's a lot of things that lead up to surrealism, in particular Dada Paris, and a number of artists who began in New York and elsewhere, moving to Paris, and really setting the stage for what becomes surrealism only after the Manifesto was written in 1924 by André Breton, the poet. Right? And that sort of brings the group together and gives them a sense of direction, and really begins to apply, in particular, Sigmund Freud's ideas about psychoanalysis, right? And Freud's ideas about the subconscious, and using art as a way of bridging the tangible world, the physical world, and the subconscious understanding, the subconscious realm, right? And the different artists sort of go about this different ways, but one of the central things that Breton brought to the mix was the idea of automatic painting, where you paint with an open start without any idea where the painting is going, with the idea that that would then begin to reveal through this automatic movement, right? This unregulated, illogical movement would begin to reveal things from your subconscious that you could then further develop. And so we see some of that in Miro as well. And then we were talking quite a bit about Miro's sort of sexual imagery, which is picked up by others, not the least of which is Dali, right? And in fact, the surrealists going all the way back to, Max Ernst even, right? Man Ray. There's a sort of misogynist side to surrealist art that turns a lot of people off. The objectification of women, link between art making and procreation, which we talked about a bit, right? All of these images that are phalluses and vaginas rendered in this sort of abstract language of form that Miro uses. Kandinsky is one of the many artists who are sort of swept up into surrealism. He's moved to Paris in the 30s and still maintains his interest in musical notation, forms that suggest sort of Kandinsky's own metaphysical music, but obviously with forms that relate to things that Miro is doing with these biomorphic, amoeba-like forms that we saw in Miro's work. We saw them in Yves Tanguy's work. We saw them on a certain level even within some of the forms that Dali likes as well. So Kandinsky gets swept up into surrealism, and as we'll see through today's lecture, a lot of people get swept up into surrealism. It becomes really this amazingly powerful movement in the 1930s, not just in Paris, but really on an international scale. Right? And I'm going to look at an artist before we look at that sort of international movement of surrealism, in particular in America. We're going to look at Paul Klee first, because there's really nowhere else to put him. He doesn't, I'm putting him under the surrealists. Why? Because there is something, he's mining childhood memories. And as part of what his works are focusing on. And he renders in a deceptively simple way, sort of like, no perspective, a reliance on outline drawings that look rather simplistic and childlike. And he's sort of striving to recapture some of that innocence. So he kind of makes sense with the surrealists, even though he's not really a member of the group, and at the same time he's never in Paris for any length of time, right? He's everywhere else. But he was friends with Kandinsky. Very, very, very good friends with Kandinsky. Going all the way back to the Blue Rider group. Right? Paul Klee had been part of that group. So back 1912, 1913, right? They're together in Munich. And they remain friends throughout their entire career. It's sort of a wonderful thing to think about these two painters as being just as close of friends as you could possibly be. And in fact, both of them were at the Bauhaus at exactly the same time. Klee had been hired first by the leader of the Bauhaus, Walter Gropius, right? Klee was the first to be hired in 1920 at the Bauhaus. He was hired to teach 2D design. Form is what they called it, right? In the Bauhaus, which is fantastic, right? Can you imagine going to art school and, okay, 2D design, I'm going to take Paul Klee, right? And then I'm going to take color theory with Kandinsky. You know, it's just, imagine what a hotbed of creativity that must have been at the Bauhaus. And when Klee got hired in 1920, he convinced Gropius that he should hire Kandinsky, right, to come at the same time. And Kandinsky came in then in 1922, right, after Paul Klee did. So it was Klee who got Kandinsky hired. And here's my favorite picture of the two of them. It's Kandinsky on the left and Klee on the right, standing on the beach, right, in northern Germany. And just the way they've got their arms interlocked and shaking hands, right? And also, Paul Klee was a fairly large man as well, right? And Kandinsky with the glasses, yeah.
I lost my notes. Were they hired for?
What?
Were they hired for?
They were hired at the Bauhaus. Okay, there's a couple of lectures that went entirely through the history of the Bauhaus, that architectural institution that was established in 1919 that swept up a bunch of expressionists and eventually constructivists, right? But the early people that were there were expressionists, and that's kind of where Klee and Kandinsky come in. They were expressionists, but also very much people who were theory heavy. And Paul Klee wrote quite a bit about art theory as well, right? And so if we remember what we learned about the Bauhaus, it was this place where potential architects are learning all aspects of art making, and in particular a great interest in the nature of materials, what they can and cannot do, and how to best exploit their qualities as part of the design, and that they would be training up-and-coming artists to not only be architects, but the idea that architecture is the art that encompasses all of the arts. Right? You need to be able to be a painter and a sculptor and a tapestry designer, and if you're going to make architecture, you got to be able to design all these things, right? It's a work of art that contains all the arts, which is very similar to what we saw with De Stijl, right? Where all of the arts are sort of contained in the De Stijl building, right? And in fact, there was a movement for a while from the Bauhaus to try and swallow De Stijl even, right? So Klee and Kandinsky are coming now to teach sort of some of the basics that you need in order to work your way forward. And since one of the central tenets of the Bauhaus was a focus on the natural qualities of materials and how to exploit those qualities and how to design for those, right? So if you're making if you're going to make a teapot, would it look the same if you're using brass as it would if you're using ceramics? You got to think about the relationship between your design and the materials you're using, right? If you're making a mural painting, right, Mary, you're making very large paintings right now. Making a mural painting, there's one thing to be doing with a brush. It's another thing to be doing it with a micron pen. You've got to be thinking about the relationship between the materials and what you're going to do, right? So it exists in the art level, but also obviously in the design level. And what this means is that when we look at Paul Klee, there's this deceptive simplicity that's very similar to surrealism in his drawing style. Just really simple, not a lot of, sometimes there's a bit, but not much in the way of perspective, right? Really simple outlines, childlike. But at the same time, there's an incredible sophistication in his use of materials. He is so sensitive to how materials work, and his things are just, they're objects that are precious in the way that he handles material. Right? And I want to look at some details. We've got a really great Paul Klee collection. So this particular work, called Cathedral, right, is defined by its craftsmanship. Now you can see that the drawing itself suggests like a city square, perhaps, architecture everywhere we look. Some of it might even be quasi-Islamic. You can see the crescent moon, for example, at the top, just off center at the top. And as we look through, we start to get the suggestions of gables, of roofs, arches, architecture everywhere, but drawn incredibly simplistically. And in a way that, and this is typical for a lot of clays, not all of them, but in a way that covers the entire surface almost like a fabric, like a carpet, right? Mary.
What was the material?
Well, I'm getting there. I haven't said it yet, right? Good. So what he's done here is he's done it it's on a piece of paper that's been mounted to a board with wax. And he's using what's called wax resist, where he draws in wax and then lifts it through the other surfaces that he's rubbed with color. And so it gets this sort of ghostly overlay look, where you can see that there are these patchworks of almost like a quilt of different colors, of greens and oranges, and subtle variations in shades, right? And there's a layer of wax then that's over the top of it, and the wax breaks through and makes the lines. It's really complicated. And Mary, if it's confusing to you, it's because it's still confusing to me. I can look at Paul Klee's again and again and again, and I look at the technique, and I'm dumbfounded by how we got to the final aspect. But we can see some elements of the wax that's been heated and ironed over the top of it if you look at the edges, right? And then down at the bottom, you can see the signature there, or at least the title and the date. His signature's up above, right? Is that right? And then there's a cathedral over here. And you can see the paper mounted to this piece of red board that's been mounted inside that frame. So there's an incredible level of craftsmanship. But one of the things he does here, and often, is he'll sort of scumble it a bit on purpose to give it that sort of rough-edged, childlike quality that pulls him into the sort of orbit of the surrealists, right? Although I don't think he would have himself have accepted that as a title. I don't think he would have bought into everything that's surrealist about surrealist art. So what I'd recommend, I mean, if you're into this stuff, and honestly, we all should be at one point or another, go to the Phillips has a fantastic Paul Klee collection. And they almost always have a room of Paul Klees out at any given time. And they're just, each one of them, worth going into with a magnifying glass, just to try to figure out how do you get to the finished product, because it's that level of craftsmanship that comes out of the Bauhaus, right, is what he's bringing to this, that high level of meticulousness and care. And I think that, for all of us, the lesson of Paul Klee would be that sometimes a little bit of extra time is worth it. A little bit of extra meticulousness and paying attention to every element and how exactly it works. Elaine.
On top there's a word.
Yes, there is.
And what's the name of the technique you said again?
Wax resist.
But is this for the horseshoe? Isn't it like you put like a coin and the paper over it and you
For the words? No. The words, in fact, the words that you see there is the watermark on the paper. So if you buy a finer artist's paper, right, usually it's made on a screen. And going back even to the Renaissance, what they would do, paper makers would sew something into the screen that when you put the mulch, right, the emulsified rag. Okay, you know how to make paper making. Paper making 101, okay? Most papers we're used to are made out of trees, right? Milled plant matter. And still to this day, quite a bit of other papers, even artist paper, are made of milled plant matter. But most finer artist papers are made from cotton, rag, right? And the way you make it is you mulch it, right? You pulverize it in water, right? Until it just becomes this slurry, this, right? It still has some of the, and this would work with wood as well, right? Just mulch it up with like a mortar and pestle until it became this slimy goo, emulsified in water. But it still has enough fibrous texture that if you put a screen into it and lift it out, the water will drain through, and you get a thin layer of goo. And then you let it dry, and that becomes paper. Because it has this natural collagen that holds it. Okay? That's paper making 101. Now, with the screen, mark on the paper so that the paper maker could identify what paper came from whom, right? And that helps us as historians going back to, prints by Albrecht Dürer, right? Is we can find the watermark. That's what it's called, the watermark.
Like the branch of the.
Yeah, well, sometimes back in the olden days it would just be a symbol, and a lot of people use the same symbol, but there's encyclopedias out there of watermarks, right? My first time I was an intern at the Met in my graduate work in the print room, and the first thing I was doing was I was tracing watermarks. I was going back through prints and holding them up and find the watermark, and then going back to a catalog which had a measure to the millimeter to find out which watermark with which paper, right? Okay, so that's a watermark now. Now modern watermarks, 20th century paper and beyond. So Montgolfier, I can't remember the O-N, Carson, I think. Carson had Montgolfier, so there's an O-N, an ampersand, right? Montgolfier, that's the paper maker. The modern ones, the modern paper makers tend not to have the screens in the same way, but they still have the watermark. So, have you seen watermarks on some of the paper Mary's given you, right? And when I was a printmaker, back in the day, I used to prize that piece of paper that had the watermark as well, right? So what he's done is he's rubbed this, he's taking advantage of that as part of it. That's a piece of the artwork that he had nothing to do with, right? But he's profiting from it by rubbing his color and the wax into the watermark, right? So that's there's a signature there too, where you can see the red underneath it and the clay up there as well, right? I'm a huge fan. I mean, I just one of the people I look forward to whenever we do modern is getting to Paul Klee, because his technique is deceptive, right? The drawing is so simplified, and sometimes the finished product is intentionally left kind of roughshod, but they're so sophisticated at the same time, right? So here, the arrival of the jugglers. We have this wonderful sort of that circus motif, right? Jugglers are part of a performer. So, like Picasso's Saltimbanques. And who's going to be happy for the arrival of the jugglers? But little kids, right? It's entertainment of sorts. And in this case, he's got a piece of cardboard, and he's taken clay putty and rubbed that over the top of the cardboard, and then he's scratched into it and painted over the top of that, right? So he's really investigating how different combinations of media, right, different combinations of materials work and how they behave differently, and working them through in a sophisticated yet childlike way. That is the hallmark of everything that Paul Klee does. So charming little figures waving flags, walking around with dogs, right, on carts. The parade leading to the town with the entertainers arriving as the traveling circus has got here, right? This is, and then done in this rather complex manner. And again, I think going back to Mary's question, I have to go, every time I go look at this, I'm still like, but how did we get there, right? Is he painting it before the scratch marks or after? Because the scratch marks do seem to bear, sometimes, the putty underneath, right? He loves playing with the surface. There's more to making a work of art for him than simply the design. The surface quality, the quality of the materials is always something that Klee is every bit as much interested in, as are, obviously, the play of the different colors, right? And how sort of they're really wonderful. Look at areas like this really subtle pink that's laid over the top of that green, right? And how the green on the flag is slightly different than the body behind it, right? But it's almost like he's going back in with the paint and rubbing it, maybe even with his finger, or with a piece of cloth, just to get almost like an airbrush technique, right? An airbrush feel, and just with a great sensitivity, right? And you can imagine working on this, that he was just, as tight as he could be. End of his life, in the late 30s, he moves to Switzerland. Famous anecdote, not famous, an anecdote I responded to was his downstairs neighbors, he was renting a place for a studio, the downstairs neighbors came and banged on the door and said, "Stop with all the racket." And he goes, "Oh, I'm sorry, sometimes when I'm making art I dance and I don't realize I'm doing it." Right? Which I think this is so wonderful, right? He's just up there and he's sort of in front of the thing and and playing with it. And that sense of sort of joyful play is everywhere within his compositions. I think they're just wonderful things. I always think that if I could make an object like somebody's object, it might be a Paul Klee. I just don't have the patience, right? I even though I used to do etchings, I just don't have the patience for this.
Sorry,
No, it's okay, Aileen.
so, I don't know, is there anything about the architecture of that particular house there? Because it seems like the house as a key drawing.
It isn't, but it's not always. That's a good point. Yeah, because he's at the Bauhaus, right? You would think that does the architecture then play into this, right? He stays at the Bauhaus for a very long time. He's there all the way till the point when it's closed in 1932, right? The Bauhaus stays open through the right-wing elections, through Kristallnacht, and Hitler finally has it shut down in 1932, at which point Paul Klee decides that it's better to move on and ends up in Switzerland, which is neutral during the war. But your question of whether or not the architecture here has anything to do with it, it's an ill choice on my part to show you two that have buildings, because not all of them do, right? So,
What I thought was that this, in the middle, he makes this cubic
right.
geometric, something that kids would not draw. In the back, it was like.
But at the same time, it's drawn in the way that kids do draw them, almost, right? I mean, I think the only part that violates that is there's this sense of a little balcony area that comes out here that looks almost two-dimensional. But again, even at that, it's not obeying laws of perspective, right? It just seems to come out in 3 dimensions, but it still has almost that sense of your house, chimney, the way that children do draw things as pared down to its barest essentials, right? And that's kind of true for everything he draws, even the proportions of that dog, right, with that great big schnoz, right? And there was this time I was walking through the National Gallery years ago, shortly after I moved here, and there was this area that had these smaller pictures in it, and there was this little picture by Toulouse-Lautrec of his family on a wagon going through the woods, and the dog was running alongside, and they were being pulled by a horse, and there was a little kid drawing it with his parents. It was so cute. And he was drawing the picture as he saw it, and all he saw was the dog. And it was just like, that's what he was drawing. It's like, what's that? It's like, that's that picture. And the parents were like, where's the cart? Oh, it's over here. And it was, it wasn't. But he knew where it was the dog. That's all. And for Klee, there's that same sense of what's going to interest him. And it has that, I think that sense of wonder is what gives it its everlasting sort of interest and charm. And I don't want to say this interest is only charm, because I think these things are incredibly sophisticated as well. Not just in technique, but sometimes with the ideas too. That by mining childhood thoughts and ideas, one can get to something that makes us some sort of shared humanity that we have. Before we learn, to hate our neighbors, right? The sort of things that we learn being in society, how to be rude, But when we're kids, everybody gets along, They're everybody's friends. And early, just like not my kid. But you see kids in the park that just run up immediately and talk to people, We don't do that anymore. It's like, at first I don't know this person. And you don't, you learn, you acculturate to this idea of being individual rather than part of a group. And I think that sense of the humanism that we share is something that Klee, like the Surrealists, are kind of trying to get to, right? What are the things that are truly part of being human that we forget about as we cover them up, right? Or as Freud would say, as we sublimate them with our adult learning and experience. But get back to something more primal. And that's a theme we've seen again and again in modern art, right? Trying to get back to something more primal. That the modern experience has somehow removed us from what it really means to be alive. And think back to Kirchner, the idea of getting back to something primal is an important element. One last Klee, and of the 3, probably my favorite, a tree nursery. So here he's reduced. So now, Elaine, no buildings, right? But at the same time, it is and it's an arranged environment, right? It's a built environment. Because a tree nursery is where you take nature and it's contained, right? And it's domesticated, if you will. If we can use that word for plants, right? It's horticulturally determined by people. And you can see he gives us that, he loves these grids that come across the entire composition. And in this case, the grids have a detail or two, right? They're really wonderful. I think it's thick, and again, like I said with Clay, I'm not 100% sure how he does stuff. But what I think he's done is he's laid the gesso on really thick. Gesso is the coating over the top of the canvas before you put the paint down. Because if you put paint right on a canvas, the oil will cause the canvas to rot. Right? So you need a prime on top of it. And it's usually a mixture of glue and something that makes it white, although other artists have used other colors. Right? Whiting is usually what's lead white mixed into some horse hooves that have been boiled up to give you a gelatinous glue. Right? You rub that over the surface, and back these days you just go to Michael's and you buy one, right? Or something like that. But back in the day, you would cut the wood, you'd stretch the canvas, you'd put on your own gesso, okay? In this case, since you're putting on the gesso, you don't have to put it on as thin as can be, which is what they do when you buy it at Michael's because it's expensive. If they can do it thinner and cheaper, then they're going to be able to sell you that frame for $6.95, and even, as opposed to $14.95, and still make a profit. Here he's laying it on himself, so he's laying it on really thick. And then he comes back and he scratches it. So he's doing all of the drawings are sort of with what appears to be some sort of needle, right? Some sort of stylus that scratches all of the different forms that we see. And then he comes over the top, and I'm thinking again that he's rubbing it with pigment. And the pigment is catching, right? He's obeying to a certain degree the horizontal striations. And he's interested in the colors as they move from yellows to greens to blues to purples, right? He's interested in those color changes, which are subtle, really subtle, and work really well together. But he's also interested in how that paint, as he's rubbing it on there, I'm saying rubbing is my guess, right? But as he's rubbing it on there, you'll notice it catches the lines that he's scratched. And it fills inside of those lines as he's rubbing it on the surface. So it's working like a print, right? Like an etching, where it grabs inside the carved lines. So he's not going to try and transfer anything. He's going to leave it there. And so we end up with these lines that are really deep pigment of the same color that's the background, right? And that's what's forming the line. That and the shadows that you see as you look at it, right? And here close up you can see even better how this works. And you can see the thickness of the gesso, that's the upper right corner, and how those colors have been rubbed in. You can even see that with some of the blue trees, and again he's reducing everything to this primitive language of form. But with some of those blue trees, he's rubbed the purple in around the branches, and with some of the purple trees, he's rubbed the blue in around the branches. And sometimes he even makes the forms not necessarily look like trees anymore, but sort of look like runes that you might find on ancient carved stones, right? Something very primitive about it, like Indian drawings, Native American Indian drawings on rock walls. It has that same sense, or even old Celtic crosses in Ireland that you would see that have scratched lines on it. Graffiti even, right? I mean, the word graffiti comes from the Italian word to scratch, sgraffito, right? And there's that sense that he's sort of making these modern versions of very, very primitive forms. There's a signature up above, and the date 29, clay written at the very top left. And again, more of these. You can see the thickness of the pigment or the gesso and how he's now rubbed those paints into it. And then it took me a longest time to find these, but there's people. There are two people, lower right corner. See them? Amid all the trees. And I get this idea, Tremers, that he's playing with ideas, is that it becomes a sort of ancient mythology. That's Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. You know, what other place would you find a sort of a managed garden with two people in it, right? Now, he doesn't spell it out, right? There's no snake, so far as I can see anywhere. There's nothing even to suggest that the two people that are here are necessarily different genders. They're built exactly the same. In fact, they're built exactly the same as the trees in many ways, but they're the two with the round heads here. But I think he's making allusions, right? And certainly this comes up repeatedly, that the mythologies and ancient stories are often viewed by psychoanalysts as the place where humanity has embedded and communicated its deepest, most beloved truths, can be found in reading these kinds of texts, whether it's Greek mythology or Christian creation stories, that they hold that truth for us and try to communicate something beyond the simple narrative. And I think Clay's picking up on that, right? We've got this couple now within their tree nursery, and certainly suggests, at least to me, an idea that this might well be the primal garden, the Garden of Eden. And that would fit with his sort of interest in childlike forms, getting back to something at the root of everything. I could show you Paul Klee all day, but this was a bit of a surprise to me, because I'd not been up to the Baltimore Museum of Art in a while when I saw this. And it's just, again, it's just absolutely charming. The traveling circus, so it's very much like our arrival of the jugglers. Here are our two circus performers coming now to perform, a ballerina of sorts in red tights, some sort of juggler man with red eyeglasses on and a sombrero, a little donkey or a horse or a dog, but drawn as simple can be, right? Just the outline and stick legs. And then who knows what that form is. But again, a sophistication of technique. The drawing left simple, but the actual organization and application of paint left incredibly sophisticated, right? And incredibly meticulous, to where it becomes as interesting to look at it regardless of its subject matter, and just as the way in which the surface has been created is absolutely fascinating, right? The end of Paul Klee's life turned rather sour, unfortunately. Like I said, Hitler closed the Bauhaus early 30s, 31, 32, which was good for the rest of the world in a way, because all the people that had been working at the Bauhaus took Bauhaus ideas to the rest of the world. So we talked about Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, right? Constructivist artist, ends up at the Bauhaus. He winds up, first goes to London, and then winds up in America, right? Oscar Schlemmer, the guy who made those Meccano men, right? Also ends up in the United States. Walter Gropius, the founder of the Bauhaus, ends up in America, right? Kandinsky ends up in Paris. This because this great diaspora of the Bauhaus artists taking those ideas pretty much everywhere, right? After the Bauhaus was closed down. Paul Klee ends up going to Switzerland, which is where he was from originally. It's his home country, right? He's Swiss by birth, but spent his active career, most of it in Germany. And after the closure of the Bauhaus in 1932, Klee moves back to Switzerland to be safe, basically, right? He doesn't have to worry about his status there because he's a native. Right? And in 1934, he is diagnosed with a terminal disease, which lasts the next 6 years of his life. And it's a horrible disease. It's called scleroderma. I'd never heard of this, but he couldn't swallow, right? And he just wasted away for the last 6 years of his life, but he kept painting. So he'd had it now for 3 years by the time he paints Traveling Circus. And for me, I mean, it almost makes you want to cry. This guy who's got this interest in childlike innocence and is now still has that sort of that hope, that sense of hope, even though he's now 3 years into a disease where he's basically, I don't even know how they were feeding him, if it was intravenously or not, right? But slowly but surely he could not swallow anymore at all, and eventually this killed him, right? But the year after he was diagnosed in 1933, or no, right before he was diagnosed, 1933, 500 works in 1933 alone. Now you want to talk about the sort of combination of dedication, and if you think about 500 works where each of the works is not just tossed off, but incredibly meticulous in its craftsmanship, it is absolutely fascinating, right? But like I said, this progressed and then eventually died in 1940 from simply just wasting away, which is quite sad. So with him and Kandinsky, we're talking about artists who get swept up into the Surrealist movement that aren't necessarily Surrealist per se, but share a lot of thoughts and ideas with them, right? And what we're going to see is that Surrealism is a movement that really kind of swallows everything around it. Has huge implications everywhere we look in art in the 1930s, right after it gets going. So remember that early years of Surrealism is 24 to 30 or so in Paris. A lot of expat artists, a lot of people coming back to Paris after the war, right? We get Dali and Miro are there from Spain, right? Man Ray is there from America, right? Max Ernst has gone there from Germany, right? This is sort of the hotbed of Surrealism in Paris, developing out of Dada. There are other artists in Paris as well who get kind of swept up in Surrealist ideas. And I want to look at one of them, which is Picasso. Now, we ditched Picasso a long time ago, right? I guess not that many years, given that we moved kind of slowly through the 20s. But, we left Picasso in the aftermath of Cubism, right? Where he's returned to painting from the collages of synthetic Cubism, but he's painting them as if they were collages, right? His paintings emulate a collage. They aren't really collage, but they look like they would have been. So he paints areas that look like cutout sheets of paper, fragments of guitars, areas that appear to be bits of wallpaper or rug, right? But everything painted, and already mixing sand into his works at such an early time. Picasso continues to do this into the 20s and into the 30s. But as he moves into the 20s, we see Picasso, especially in the mid-20s, get caught up here and there, fits and starts, with Surrealism, but on his own terms. Like you would never mistake one of his Surrealist pieces for a Miro. But you can see echoes of it. So here's our cover boy, right, from the canvas side. This Harlequin musician. We've seen Picasso working with Harlequins before. Remember, the Harlequin was one of the Saltenbach family, right? And the Harlequin was for Picasso a self-portrait. And he used it as a self-portrait on numerous occasions, where he would present us a self-portrait in the guise, in the costume of Harlequin, one of these costumed actors who played the same role in every comedy that they were in, right? Harlequin behaved a particular way, yeah? No matter what movie he was in. Remember sorry about that. Whatever play he was in, right? He would perform exactly the same way. And in this case, he's a musician, right? So he's got Harlequin's clothing with the diamond patterns of red and yellow, holding a guitar, which we've seen for Picasso is a motif that appears again and again in his work. But as we look at the figure of Harlequin, and again painted as if it were a synthetic cubist collage, right? Areas of color that are not meant to represent anything except for these collaged elements that he'd been doing in the teens. But what he adds to this is the area around the face with that tiny little smiley face. Not quite sure what that is next to it, with the eyelashes around it, right? The ruff of his collar, almost menacing with those teeth that come out from it. There's a nice detail of all of that. Again, thickening the pigment and playing with it, sometimes with brush and sometimes with palette knife, and sometimes with sand as well, into the piece. And you can see he's changed his mind a few times as well. So the green bit that's over the forehead of the figure, you can, with your eye, trace out the highlight to where there was something thicker painted going off to about, 10 o'clock on the clock there, but has now been come and painted back over again as he's come to the final composition. Yeah,
You said like that little smiley face as if it's the face, but what if the little circle to the left is like an eye, and then the thing with the eyelashes is an eye, and then the two dots are like a nose?
Ooh, I hadn't thought of that. Or does he want it both ways,
Yeah.
right? So you're saying this is an eye. Could that be the nose as well? We've seen a lot of Picassos where things turn and become angular in profile, and playing with profile. Certainly that looks ear-like, but this could also be ear-like here, couldn't it?
Isn't the cover of your canvas?
Sorry?
Is this the cover of your canvas?
Yeah.
That's what I just said, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that is the cover off, the middle part of it is the cover off the middle. What's interesting about these details, right, that make up the face here, is one we've seen Picasso do faces before when he was doing those analytic cubist heads, right? But they never really looked like that. They never had that look. What that look is very childish again, right? Childlike, simplistic, and sort of almost innocent in a strange sort of way. But that innocence tempered by the fact that you've got those sharp things that come off of the ruff that remind us sort of teeth or something along those lines, right? That give it a sense of menace. And for Picasso, gosh, this idea of it being at once welcoming and menacing, that's all the way through his career, right? Even, we'll see, he's actually fairly happy at this point in his life. We'll see that in just a second, right? But I think on a certain level, one of the things that he's channeling here, sorry about that, is, I'll come back to that, I will promise, is probably Miro. By 1924, Miro has come to Paris, right? He'd been there since 1922. And in 1924, we have the Surrealist Manifesto. And Miro is, remember that when Miro comes to Paris, he came to Paris because Picasso had gone there and been successful. And by this point in his career, Picasso is successful, right? He's no longer the starving, blue period, depressed artist. He's incredibly successful, right? And not only is he successful monetarily speaking, right, by 1924. Right? He's very monetarily successful. He's making money, getting good commissions. He'd already worked on designs for the Russian ballet, like the Ballet Russe. So he's really hit it. And over and above that, in 1924, he knows full well that Cubism has changed the world. Right? I mean, he is successful monetarily. He is successful even if he never made a dime. He's one of the most successful artists in the world by 1940. Right? Everybody knows now Cubism, you cannot escape it. It's everywhere. Miro, when he comes to Paris, comes because Picasso had gone there and had so much success as a foreign artist, as a Spanish artist working in Paris. So Miro comes specifically to sort of follow Picasso's example, to try to be as successful as he is, and to a certain degree he is, although it doesn't have the same revolutionary impact that Picasso has. Right? Now we have these two Spanish artists from the same city. They're both from Barcelona, right? Both of them in Paris in the early 20s. Any surprise that they're going to be rubbing shoulders and looking at what each other does? Absolutely none whatsoever, right? So we haven't seen this one before, right? This one's up in Baltimore, but just your standard Miro, where again it's a portrait, and there's those tiny little features that that mean multiple things. Eyes that become buttocks or boobs, right? I'm sorry, I should say that more professionally. Memories, right? biomorphic forms that might be a mouth. But when you start looking at areas like this, and you start to then go back over to Picasso, you start to see where he's picking these things up, right? And I think that there's a dynamic interplay between Picasso and Miro during this period. There's also a dynamic interplay between Picasso and Matisse at this point, which we don't have time to get into, right? There's a lot going on. Picasso's an incredible figure in the 20s. And what's, I think, absolutely incredible about him is that while he might do these quasi-surreal things on his own terms, right? Surrealist works that are Picasso's take on surrealism and incorporating surrealist ideas into his Cubist idiom, right? Within a year, he can do something that's totally different from that. This man just shifts from work to work. Right? A year earlier, one of his most classical works. Never even think it might be a Picasso because it's so perfectly drawn and so beautifully colored. It looks more like a Matisse in a way, except that Matisse would never draw the figure that clearly, right? Model it so well. And Picasso shows his amazing understanding of contour drawing. That's the outline that just through its variance gives us a sense of three-dimension. Remember the Rose period, those two standing nudes that we saw? The two boys from the National Gallery. Do you remember this picture? It's been a long time. But he's been drawing. He's such a fantastic draftsman. And you forget about it because sometimes he just turns his back on that skill in order to pursue other things. Right? So Picasso is, during the 20s, kind of all over the map and doing these things, moving from one canvas in one style to one canvas in a totally different style, with such ease that it's scary how good he can be in totally different idioms. Just a few years later, what about this, right? Doesn't this remind you of constructivism, right? It's like he's channeling all these ideas that are coming at him that themselves go back to Cubism. So it's kind of coming full circle and coming back into Picasso. So his favored motif, right? The guitar, we can see an echo of it. Real pieces of paper, real pieces of decorative sticky paper that you would use inside of a cabinet, applied to the surface of wood. This is very big too, right? It's about 3.5 feet tall. So it's really quite large. And then the strings of the guitar are just simple pieces of twine that have been strung on nails that he's driven into the board, right? So it's totally a kind of a constructivist idea. So in the 20s, Picasso's just bouncing all over the place, right? Picking up some things from Miro, picking up some things maybe from Matisse, picking up some things from the constructivists, and doing them all really well as he's bouncing all over the place. Okay. By the 30s, his works become more closely surrealist, and there seems to be a reason for this. And I think the reason is that he becomes more interested in his identity as a Spaniard in the mid-1930s. And we'll talk about this historically, why that's the case. But certainly with this, the idea of a bullfight as a theme is a particularly Spanish theme, right? Now the French do it as well, the Greeks do it as well. Everybody on the Mediterranean does bullfights, at least on the northern part. But even today we tend to associate it more with Spain than any other country, as does Picasso, right? And so we have an image of the arena, right, which is around the flags up above, the crowds, and this bullfight in the center, with two matadors, one on horseback, and one on foot, subduing the bull in the center, right? And the way in which Picasso illustrates this, articulates it, is with that sort of childlike style that we've seen so many different surrealists use. Miro is an obvious example. So our matador on the right becomes a stick figure with color. Again, is that a headhunter this time inside the triangle?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry?
Why you asking me?
Because you're the one that said the other one wasn't a head, which I believe.
Just suggested.
Yeah, I know. And so
The one with the
this is,
doctor.
and that's why I'm asking again. Yes, but it's good for you to suggest. Just because I'm a doctor doesn't mean I know jack
Okay.
about this stuff, right? I'm making it up as I go along. So it's good to question it because I think with the surrealists, right? This is a good point. I'm making this up as I go along. This is a good point. The fact that you could see it differently than I do is part of the agenda. You know, it's part of what they want to have happen. Because what they're doing is they're getting to the primal thing that we share, but you see it different than I do because we're no longer in touch with that primal nature. Does that make sense? That our individuality maybe suppressed the thing that makes it easy to understand for everybody the same. And that we should all bring them. So I was asking you politely. I wasn't making fun of you. I was asking you politely. Could we see this a different way than I'm used to seeing it since you were right last time? Anyway, we got down here. I think that's meant to be his leg kicking out to the right. Although it's also kind of phallic in its way, right? But I think that those are the tights of the Matador's costume. And Picasso is responding, like he did with the Harlequin, to this highly decorative costume, right, of the Matador. And again, with the cape stretched over, that looks almost like a parasail or something like that. And even though this is a very violent scene, right, this is the death of the bull, there's something innocent and dance-like about the way in which Picasso brings this figure in from the right into the bull. And if we look on the other side, we also sort of begin to see traces of Miro, that elongated neck, which we saw in the shooting star picture on the horse. There's our second Matador with the same head there. And you can see here that our bull ain't going down without a fight, right? He's rendered its head also within a triangle and those big primal teeth, right? But the bull has gored the horse, right? And where the goring should be, it's turned blue, but the blood runs out. So the actual wound itself is not red, right? But he's opened up the stomach of the horse. So it's an incredibly violent scene, but rendered in this playful, childlike manner. And on a certain level, Picasso is getting back to his Spanishness, even though he's in France, right? But some of the rendering of it, and in particular the shape that the horse takes, the shape the figures take, and this interest in mining memory and infancy, is what he's picking up from having been around the surrealists in Paris. The reason for Picasso mining his Spanish nature is political. Spain was in turmoil in the 1930s. There was a rising far-right party allied with the fascists who advocated that Spain return from a democratic government to a monarchy, right? Not rule by election, but rule by inheritance. But there was what they call a Republican government, one that had been elected by the people, but they were under threat. And the person doing the threatening was General Francisco Franco, Generalissimo Francisco Franco, the High General. Right? And Franco lived, all the way to 79 or so as dictator of Spain, because he was bucking the elected government. There was a series of new elections where he supported opposition party in 1936. They lost. He then decided to take over the government by force. Elections don't work, I'm just going to take it over anyway. Right? And this began in 1936, the Spanish Civil War, which lasted for 3 years until Franco was able to overthrow the government, have himself installed as dictator for life. And like I said, for the next 40 years, was the leader of Spain. Now, this turmoil happening in Spain was news throughout Europe, and this is part of the reason that Picasso, for the only time in his life that I know of, became politically engaged. as an artist, because his homeland is difficult, right? And these bullfight scenes, as well as the scene on the left, which we'll talk about next, are images that are meant as allegories for what's going on in Spain. And they're using particularly Spanish traditions in order to investigate and illuminate those problems back home. So the bullfight for him, with the bull menacing and goring the matadors who are trying to tame it, may well be seen in a couple of different ways. The bull as Spain, the matador as Franco, still fighting back. Or, and quite possibly, the bull is Franco, and the matadors is Spain. And as they try to control him, he's going to take some people down with him. There's not, as Hunter was saying before, there's not one right answer here. There's not one way to read it, right? That they're filled with these allusions to mythology that he's using on a particularly political outing, right? Political picture. So, on the left, with the idea of interest in bull as this potent metaphor, either a metaphor for Spain or a metaphor for Franco, right? The horse, Franco or Spain. Minotauromachy, it means the fight of the Minotaur. Omaki means fight of, right? So the war of, the battle of the Minotaur. And the Minotaur comes from ancient Greek mythology. You guys know the story of the Minotaur? Right? You want to tell me, Mary? The labyrinth, exactly right. So the Minotaur was the son of the wife, so he's the stepson, of King Minos of Crete, right? The island of Crete. And his wife, Pasiphae, I think her name was, right? Was actually the sister of Apollo. He married up into the gods, right? And she had gotten tricked at one point into being seduced by a bull. That is Greek mythology. That happens all the time. People sex with animals. Anyway, so Pasiphae has relations, congress, with a bull. Gives birth to a child who is half man, half bull. That's the Minotaur, right? The bull of Minos. Okay? Horus, the bull, right? Minotaur. So the Minotaur on the right is now this evil offspring, stepson of the king of Crete, who finds him so hideous that he throws him into a labyrinth to trap him for life, into which mortal humans are thrown periodically to feed him, right? And they can't find their way out. Okay? Now, is that what Picasso's illustrating? He doesn't give a rip about the particulars of the mythology, right? Some have suggested maybe that the half-naked woman in the center is Pasiphae, but I don't buy it. It's all that mythology being used for his own political allegory, right? His own personal take on mythology. So you can see the Minotaur quite well with the man's body here on the right-hand side. And this is an etching with some aquatint, right? And there's the head of the Minotaur. He's armed with a sword, and he's storming into the scene from the left. You'll notice that Picasso is always varying the proportions in order to make the statement. So this huge right arm of the Minotaur is because he's busting in from the side. And you can see that the composition is set up with one half of it being internal scene that's lit by candlelight, and one half of it being landscaping with sailboats in the background, right? So here he is. Now, directly under the bull's or the Minotaur's feet is a horse. And across the back of the horse is this half-naked woman, right? So her blouse has been ripped open. Those are her legs, right? So this body is coming up over, draped over the back of the horse here. Can you read that okay, Tim? Right? And so the horse is running this way, staring back at the Minotaur, fighting against it, and it's been wounded as well. Right? There's blood pouring out of its side here, exactly like this one. Right? So you have to think of these things as functioning with similar ideas, working back and forth. That he sees a Minotaur in that one as well, which might add to saying, okay, then this is Franco. Right? Because here, with the woman on the back of the horse, running away from the menacing, evil figure, a figure linked with insanity, right? The labyrinth is an insane place. The woman across the back of the animal being raced off is kind of a ripoff of images of Europa. Now, Europa is usually carried off by a god in the form of a bull, but Picasso's morphed that around a bit, right? She's already got a bull. So he doesn't want to confuse it, so she's on a horse. But if you look at the way in which her body is draped over the back of the animal racing away, Picasso's making reference back to images. This is one of the more famous ones, right? But there are numerous ones he could have pointed to. Of the rape of Europa. Now, Europa obviously is Europe, right? No two ways around that. If he's making reference to Europa, this is Europe, and it's been mortally wounded, right? As it tries to escape the menace of the Minotaur. It kind of makes sense now, doesn't it, in a way? Right? The Minotaur's Franco, he's menacing Europe. His ideas, his movement is a threat. And this is all before the war broke out, so it is just a threat at this point. It's a menace. The potential for danger, and Europa is trying to escape, but he's already wounded it. Probably because, as a fascist, Mussolini's in power in Italy, right? Hitler's in power in Germany. So Europe is in trouble, right? And it's trying to escape to some sort of sanctuary, right? Child with a candle, right? Two figures in a window with doves, peace. The child with the candle we think is maybe Spain. He's used children as metaphors for Spain before, back in the Saltenbaum family. We saw children in Spain. And then there's a bearded guy on the left, loincloth, climbing. Who does he look like? He looks like Jesus. And he's even trying to get away. Right? So this is this image that's meant to be an image about the fate of Europe at this particular moment. What is bringing Picasso now to his Spanish roots? It's this, right? He, as a Spanish artist in Paris, has to own up, right? He's got to ante up. He's got to get into the game. And he does, for what I think is the only time in his life, becomes a political artist. Prior to this, no politics whatsoever, right? The other thing is, I think he realizes at this point in the 30s that surrealism is a really good way to go about this. Because what surrealism does is it deals with this series of signs and symbols that can evoke ideas when put together in a way that his cubism maybe didn't work quite so well for the same thing, right? It allows very tangible signs that have multiple reference points to bring into them, rather than simply referencing a momentary experience, like sitting at a cafe, right? We couldn't be farther from sitting at a cafe. We couldn't be farther from Harlequin musicians, right? This is Picasso deeply engaged with the issues of his day at this moment in the mid-1930s. Now we'll wrap up Picasso on Friday. We'll move into American art that will take us into abstract expressionism, which will be sort of our last section, right? So there's a little bit more Picasso, one or two more works, and then we're jumping into America. Okay? So I will see you guys on Friday.